Hi, I'm Femi Okay.
I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in The Stream. Today, the fight for net neutrality in the United States.
Is innovation being stifled?
My name is Kiran Jonalagada. I'm a volunteer with Save the Internet, and I'm on the stream.
Battle lines are being drawn in the war over net neutrality in the United States. Now, critics say current regulations give the government too much control over internet companies.
While those in favor say the rules are necessary to ensure open access of the internet. But what is net neutrality? Well, it's the idea that we should all have an open internet where data is distributed equally and fairly, meaning your internet service provider can't block or throttle web content. It also means they can't charge web companies for exclusive fast lanes.
So is net neutrality in the US actually under threat? Joining us on our set to discuss this, we have Gigi Son. She's an Open Society Foundation's fellow and former counsel to the Federal Communications Commission chairman under President Obama. We also have Evan Swartzstrauber. He's the Director of Public Affairs at Tech Freedom. That's a public policy think tank. Joining us from Salt Lake City, Utah, Josh Steinley. He's the CEO of MWI, a digital marketing agency. And in New Delhi, India, Raman Chima. He's the Global Policy Director of Access Now. Hello, everybody. Gigi, why are we doing this all over again? There was a huge, big conversation about net neutrality a couple of years ago in the United States. Why are we at this point again? I thought it was all decided.
It was all decided,
right,
and the net neutrality rules have worked very, very well. Unfortunately, the big internet service providers in the US, that's Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, and Charter, have decided that they don't want these rules, despite the fact that they're enormously popular and the American public favors them in great numbers. So they've gone to their friends at the Federal Communications Commission, new FCC Chairman Ajit Pai, to get them repealed. And he is about to start a proceeding this Thursday that will do just that.
Evan, what happened in the last 2014, 2015, 16, 17, last 2 years, where it was so disastrous for the general user of the internet that you're rethinking how the internet is distributed?
So I would say it wasn't disastrous either way, right? I mean, part of the confusion with this issue is that the average person might not notice big swings in their internet experience based on having strong net neutrality rules in place or not having strong net neutrality rules in place. But we had a relatively light touch approach to internet regulation from about 1996 until 2015 when these rules took effect, and that's what we're returning to. It will be...
We're returning to? Yeah, it's not a consultation process, or you know that this is going to happen regardless?
Once Title II is removed, yes, we will be back to the hands-off-the-net consensus that we had under the Clinton administration that was continued by the Bush administration.
Pop quiz, Title II.
Title II is a legal authority. It's a means of enforcing net neutrality. It's not the same as net neutrality. I would definitely argue that those two things are different. And
so it's like treating the internet providers like it's a service like electricity or gas or
like a telephone company would be more accurate.
Yes.
But let's get one thing out of the way before we really get into this conversation. Net neutrality is not about regulating the internet or government oversight of the internet. Okay, net neutrality is about whether you will control your internet experience, and that's the way the internet was built. It was built so that Evan and I would have control over our internet experience. It's about whether we will control it, which is how the rules are today, or whether Comcast, AT&T, Verizon, and Comcast will control it. Whether they will pick winners and losers and decide who gets better quality of service, who gets faster service. That's not the way the internet was architected, and people don't want that. People who want that kind of control can get cable, because cable television is the perfect analogy of what we're going to have if you turn control over the internet to the internet service providers.
So Gigi, what you just raised is at the heart of the debate that I'm seeing among our online community, people who are watching this debate and falling on either side of it. So this is Sheila. She says, I'm especially concerned that letting internet service provider companies dictate who gets speed will kill small businesses that can't afford to pay their fees. She goes on to say, attention spans on the internet are extremely short, and nobody likes it when a page takes forever to load. This loses business. Josh, what do you make of her argument?
So look at the progress we've seen in technology in other spaces. So to me, this sounds like somebody saying, I'm afraid that if TV manufacturers are in charge of making TVs, that my TV is going to get smaller and have less resolution. Now, we don't have government managing TV manufacturing, and yet we see that every year TVs get cheaper, they get bigger, the resolution gets higher. Is this because government is mandating that these things happen?
But Josh, your analogy doesn't exactly work, because in this instance, we're talking about websites and companies, and then the person that's regulating them, the body, is the internet service provider.
Well, it also doesn't work.
Right, but who's regulating the internet service providers? It's consumers. Consumers are in charge of the internet service providers. If consumers don't want the internet service provider, they can go to a different internet service provider.
Okay,
now we have problems.
I must address this because this is really important.
Raman, I see you too, so you can come in after Gigi.
This is really important because I've read Josh's work, and he talks about competition, competition, competition. This FCC, this deregulatory FCC, just came out with a report that shows 87% of census blocks in the United States have a choice of 2 or fewer internet service providers. And 58% of census blocks have a choice of 0 or 1.
If you don't include wireless.
There is no competition, and even if you could switch, there are high switching costs. Your analogy doesn't work for a number of reasons. In fact, the price of broadband has not gone down precipitously because there hasn't been competition. And this is about communications networks. This is about speech. This is not about a dumb device.
The reason we don't have competition in the ISP industry is because the government has been doing favors for these ISPs for a long time. They have friends in government. They lobby the government. I have friends who run small ISPs. They run into all sorts of regulation in the ISP industry. The reason we don't have competition is because the government, with their friends, the ISPs, created this problem in the first place. Now we're trying to fix it with more government instead of viewing government as the problem in the first place.
Let me just bring in Raman. Raman, ISP, Internet Service Provider. Raman, what did you want to add?
I just wanted to say that, look, the reality is government will always be involved in the telecommunications sector. The same ISPs that Evan was just talking about will always talk to government for spectrum. They'll talk to them about licensing, permission. So look, the reality is that the telecommunications market is not an open free market. Most economists say it's a semi-monopolistic, oligopolistic market, which means that you need permissions to enter. So it's not an open free market. In fact, most ISPs use right-of-way, they use spectrum, public resources, and that means that they can act as gatekeepers. And that means the government, whether it's the US government or other governments, wherever they are, have an obligation to ensure they don't discriminate. And that's the very basis of network neutrality.
You can't dismiss the competitiveness of the market if you look at wireless, right? So Gigi makes an important point that yes, for many people, it's 2 wireline providers, but we have to talk about wireless too, because wireless is increasingly becoming a substitute for wireline access. You have 4 nationwide carriers, Sprint, Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T. And then you also have some smaller carriers that use the same spectrum like Cricket Wireless or Google Project Fi. And those speeds are ever increasing. And as we reach a 5G world, we're going to be talking about speeds that are actually more in line with your home connection than your connection on the go. And that's an extremely competitive market. You've seen T-Mobile poaching customers from Verizon, forcing them to offer an unlimited plan. AT&T's have to offer their own unlimited plan. And all the time, if consumers turn on their television, they see carriers offering to pay their cancellation fees. So that's an extremely competitive and dynamic market, and that's why I didn't want to see a 1934 regulatory framework that was designed for a landline telephone monopoly to be grafted onto a wireless marketplace, a wireline marketplace that are highly competitive and consumers are reaping the benefits.
But we're not there yet, okay? Wireless, number one, 2 of the wireless companies, AT&T and Verizon, also own wireline systems, so that's important. But, and while I agree with Evan that there is a promise of 5G bringing connectivity as fast as landline, it's not here yet, okay, and it's not a substitute. But I need to give Josh a little bit of a history lesson about regulation and internet service providers. Because in 1999 and 2000, 2001, there were 7,000 dial-up ISPs. Why? Because government passed a law, Congress passed a law called the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that required dominant internet service providers to open up their networks to competitors. Okay? The free market FCC in 2002 basically got rid of that requirement by deregulating internet service providers, and now we are down to the situation where you are lucky if you have 2. So actually it was government intervention that created that plethora of ISPs. The Washington, D.C. market had 18 internet service providers that you could choose from. Okay, we're never going to get there, okay? But we're in a situation now where you're lucky if you have two. And again, that's because we went to the so-called free market. What it did was it freed the internet service providers to gobble up their competitors and make sure that nobody else can compete.
And that's a really bleak view of the market. I mean, I would say that the light touch approach that was started by the Clinton administration, we've seen over $1.5 trillion in broadband investment from the private sector over a 20-year period. Now, that might not sound like too much or much to someone who doesn't necessarily follow this, but every $1 million you see in capital investment into this industry creates about 20 jobs. It's a huge job creator. The Progressive Policy Institute, not exactly some right-wing group, every year gives very high marks for the capital investment that broadband brings to this economy. It's a big job creator. And if you want a real example of why people should care about this, this could just sound like telecom wonkery going back and forth, but
you read my mind.
Yeah, under the previous administration, we had Title II rules, and the FCC was going to ban free data. When T-Mobile, Verizon, and AT&T, these are companies that are now competing with each other in a vibrant marketplace, they're offering consumers products like Binge On. Everyone loves to binge television. T-Mobile said video is a big congestion point on our network. Our customers love video. Why don't we let them stream as much video as they want without that counting against their data cap? Under a very, very strict interpretation of net neutrality, if you have an absolutist view of broadband where every single bit must be treated exactly the same, consumers don't get to enjoy something like a free data offering.
But they do, and they are right now.
Because this FCC has closed that investigation into zero rating.
Did not ban zero rating.
Yes, hold tight for a moment. This is a conversation that includes other people. Malika.
Well, Evan, you mentioned somewhere in that sentence, you said why people should care, and bringing this back to that. So one of those reasons people online are saying is thinking of the communities that will be affected most. This is Americana, and she says that it equals poor folks who can't compete in life, e-commerce, job hunting, monopolized cable companies, unaffordable. The digital divide still exists today. So meanwhile, think about that, ponder on that. We just got this tweet in from Keela, who says, the irony of missing this show because of slow internet. So Rahman, I see you kind of smiling there. Of course, you can't necessarily speak to the U.S. situation, but generally, are there communities that will be left out in the cold because of this?
And look, that's why the Indian experience is useful, because what happened 2 years ago when India first started its discussions on net neutrality was this exact argument that, oh, look, because we want to encourage somehow more investment in the sector, somehow those net neutrality regulations may be an impediment. What Evan talked about zero rating was in fact deeply problematic in India. Your Indian startup innovators, your entrepreneurs, you had poor people saying, we do not want to be subject to a situation where certain websites can talk to big telcos and say only they get to be zero rated. That means only their services are completely available for free. And that's why the Indian regulator, after a long, slightly painful process, after 1.2 million people wrote to them, after governors and after parliamentarians across the country wrote to them saying our people are affected, they said we'll put clear, bright line rules saying that sort of activity isn't okay. And that's the reality of what we need to keep in mind. The investment, for example, that Evan talked about and others have mentioned here is still growing in the sector. And even in the US, I saw a report from Free Press that came earlier this month, which just talked about the fact that investment is still growing in the telecom sector despite the net neutrality rules that Chairman Pai is concerned about. The fact is the sector is growing.
Well, of course, Free Press is a strong supporter of the Title II rule, so I'm not expecting them to release a study that shows that shows numbers that undercuts that argument. There are different studies about the impact of investment that Title II has had. And if you look at the Phoenix Center, George Ford wrote a study. It's not that Title II went into effect and all of a sudden the sky collapsed, right? That should not be the purpose of this discussion. And just because the sky didn't fall,
let me share something.
Doesn't mean something.
Let me share something
was good
from your Tech Freedom Twitter feed here.
I guess someone's watching.
We have net neutrality here. which is everyone has access to the internet at the same speed. And then we've got Title II here, which currently is some form of regulation and rules in the way that your internet service provider can operate. And we have it dressed up in wolf's clothing here. What are you trying to say?
I'm trying to say that net neutrality is not the same as Title II. Net neutrality has always been the way people experience the internet. It means getting access to lawful content online.
Why should we trust the big companies?
You don't have to trust them. So once Title II is gone,
right,
broadband jurisdiction will go back to the Federal Trade Commission. And it's not just the Federal Trade Commission. It's also the Department of Justice, and it's also your state attorney general.
Do they have the expertise as the same expertise as the Federal Communications
They do not.
Commission?
If I can address this, please, because it's really important. The net neutrality rules we have now, which are strong, which prohibit paid prioritization, they prohibit discrimination, cannot survive unless they are grounded in Title II authority. So this is really a debate, not so much about net neutrality, because Evan and I probably would agree about 90% of what net neutrality should be, but this is exactly what you said, Femi. It's whether the agency, which is tasked, has been tasked since 1934 with overseeing communications networks, should have any role at all in overseeing the most important communications network of our lifetime. And Evan and the ISPs, and by the way, the Phoenix Center, and all the research you're seeing about how net neutrality harmed investment are all paid for by the internet service providers. There's no analyst who says, no analyst, and most of them are industry analysts, who says, yes, Title II affected investment. But most importantly, no publicly traded ISP has told the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is an agency that regulates them, and they have not told their investors that Title II has affected investment. So people have to listen to what the ISPs tell Wall Street and not what they tell people in Washington.
So Title II is not the
only
only way.
I was going to jump in to say that companies are most honest when they speak on earnings calls, right? They don't want to mislead investors. They don't want to mislead financial regulators. And what Gigi mentioned is a fact nearly uniform across the world. Whenever telecom companies have actually spoken in their earnings calls, they have never identified network neutrality regulation as
But
I will pick up on Raman's point.
All forms
Raman,
of
if only there's video could be prioritized in some way.
We lost you for just a little bit, your connection, but I wanted to pick up on your point because we got a tweet just like it. This is Joseph, who says, ISPs lie all the time about investment to the public, but they tell the truth to investors. So here's what one group of people are trying to do about it. This is a protest that happened just a few hours ago via the group Protect Our Internet. They are outside the FCC offices here in Washington, D.C. You can see them holding their signs, accusing the chairman of working for telecoms, not for people. Of course, he does not right now, but he is a former lawyer for Verizon. You see other posters here: without net neutrality, our computers are trash. So, Josh, I wanted to get your thoughts on this protest and on what they're saying.
I think this issue has been divided into two sides that aren't the only two sides in this. People see this as a battle of the ISPs versus the people, with the government representing the people. The way I see it is either you trust the market or you trust government to regulate this issue better. But people don't tend to see the market as a regulatory body. They don't see consumers as regulating this issue, but consumers definitely regulate this issue. They vote with their dollars. And the people I find that are in favor of net neutrality legislation, typically, when I dig down deep, they have a deep and abiding trust in the government. They trust the government to represent them, to represent their views. And that seems to be the fundamental difference. Do you trust the free market, or do you trust government? I don't trust the government. I don't trust what the government's done over the past 100 years. So I look at any government regulation and I say, this is going to go somewhere bad eventually. If it's not bad now, it's going to get bad. I trust the people. I trust the market to regulate things. I trust the people who are spending the money to keep these companies in line much more than I trust the government to keep these companies in line.
So those are not the only options, right? So I think we've actually hit at a reasonable middle ground here. Okay, so Title II, Gigi says, is the only way to have net neutrality. That's just not. That's not the case. You had in 2005. You had Republican FCC chairmen in support of net neutrality. You have had multiple attempts at legislation in Congress. Part of the reason we're talking about net neutrality going away is because it was passed on a 3-2 partisan vote by the previous administration. Now we've had an election and the pendulum's swinging back the other way. The only way to resolve this issue for consumers to have clarity in net neutrality is to pass legislation. And Republicans and Democrats can come to the table and pass rules against blocking and throttling.
I'm really glad you brought in politics because I want to get in Ajit Pai. He is the FCC chairman. And this is what he said about politics and net neutrality. Have a listen.
Some people speculate that because our politics generally are much more polarized now, that has infected communications policy. I'm not sure what the answer is, but I'm committed to making sure that I do everything I can to lead the agency on a bipartisan basis. And when it comes to broadband deployment, for instance, we've had several votes under my chairmanship that have been unanimous in nature, getting more broadband to unserved America, removing some of the regulations that stand in the way of carriers being able to deliver digital opportunity to citizens who are on the wrong side of the digital divide. I mean, those are the nuts and bolts. That's the nuts and bolts work that the FCC traditionally has done, and I'm proud to say we've done it with Republicans united with Democrats.
Can I address that? Because Chairman Pai is a really nice guy. I like him very much, but that's really a bunch of bull hockey, if I can be very, very kind. Almost immediately from getting into office, he started to dismantle some of the priorities of the lone Democratic commissioner at the FCC, Mignon Clyburn, including Lifeline, which is a subsidy that goes to poor people to get internet, including E-Rate, which is a program that gets high-speed broadband to schools and libraries. So he's done an awful lot of things. Sometimes he hasn't even had to take a vote. He's very wily. He's used sort of the processes of the agency to slowly dismantle some of the programs that were voted on in the last eight.
Something occurred to me as Malika and I were pulling together this conversation and the team is that how invested the different sides are and how much lobbying is going on. One of our community watching and following this conversation says, I hope you ask the Tech Freedom guest about the money they receive from the phone and cable lobbyists to oppose net neutrality. And then this is a conversation that's come up before. One of your colleagues says that Tech Freedom gets funding from both sides of this debate. Does that weaken your debate and what you're pushing for if you're getting funding from different sides of this conversation?
So that's an interesting point. Look, my organization receives money from people with varying views, and we oppose our donors on a variety of issues. Some of our donors support Title II, some of them don't. That's not the point. We argue for what we think is the best outcome for consumers.
Even if they give you money, so you're not going to argue their perspective if they give you money, otherwise
That's
why would they give you money?
That's not how our organization works. So
right.
If anyone wants to know how my organization operates, we operate by general support. Right. Someone can donate to our organization if they support our mission. There are no strings attached and there's no editorial control from our donors. So right. I'd like to have an argument on the merits of this issue. It's very easy to just label anyone that disagrees with you as working for the cable companies or working for someone else. I can say that Gigi only supports Title II because she wants companies like Netflix to get free transit on the internet. I don't say that because I know that Gigi has a principled view in support of Title II. She believes that that is the best path forward for consumers. I don't believe Title II is the best path forward for consumers. But if we're just throwing food at each other and calling each other shills, we're not having a real discussion. The audience here should be Congress. We have elected representatives whose job it is to work out very difficult policy questions, especially when you have an election that swings control from one party to another and you hear about dismantling a legacy, right? That's the point. And I think we shouldn't be having this big swing in telecom policy back and forth. Let's have a conversation. The Republicans in Congress are willing to work with Democrats to pass a bill that gets to the core of net neutrality. No blocking, no throttling. People should be allowed to access the lawful content of their choice. There's bipartisanship about that. We just disagree about how to enforce net neutrality.
Congress needs to take action. And I think that the challenge here is this, right? The last FCC did take a clear decision after speaking with people. The new chairman has come in and is saying we want to dismantle all of that and force it to Congress. The point was there was an open debate which millions of people took part in, which had a clear outcome. By the countries across the world looked at it, that's a fantastic outcome. And now it's being dismantled because there's a new chairman in. So that's also the reality we have to factor in.
But the chairman says he's not dismantling it because of politics.
And the public was not unanimously in support of Title II. There were many comments opposed to Title II. That's not an accurate portrayal. And look, the point of having an expert regulatory agency is not to count comments. So yes, we can say X million people said this thing and X million people said that thing. We're not doing a direct referendum. We don't make telecom policy like a plebiscite.
Take a pause for a moment because I'm taking you all online. This is far too interesting to end it here. But Malika, what's the sort of impact that you're hearing online conversations?
Well, I'll give us a little tease for the post show from Brett Glass, who says, "This has been painful to watch. I'm an ISP who's on my customer's side. The regulations harm us and them."
We will continue at stream.outerzero.com. Thanks for watching, everybody. Hello everybody, I'm glad you found us. We're at stream.outerzero.com with our post show talking about net neutrality in the United States. We are picking up where we left off. Malika.
So we ended the post show, into the main show, excuse me, with this tweet from Brett Glass, who says, "This has been painful to watch. I'm an ISP who's on my customer's side. The regulations harm us and them. I can explain how." He has a series of tweets explaining them, and you can see them on our feed with hashtag AJStream. But he says none of them has ever actually connected a new customer to the net, meaning our guests here on this panel, as I did this very morning. Gigi, can you explain why, as he says in his first tweet, that this is something that harms both ISPs and customers, regulations?
My answer to Brett is put it on the record, Brett. Show me your harm. There are plenty of ISPs that not only support net neutrality, but also support the legal authority underlying it, okay? I want to address Evan's point about going to Congress, okay? Going to Congress wouldn't be a bad idea if it was maybe a different Congress, because this Congress wants to strip the FCC of any oversight over broadband. And I mentioned this in the prior show, okay, is that it cannot be the case that the agency that is tasked by law with overseeing communications networks should have no oversight over broadband. And this is what the Republicans in Congress want to do. They want to take that oversight and give it to the Federal Trade Commission, which is a great agency, but it doesn't have expertise in how networks are managed, number one. And number two, it doesn't have rulemaking ability. So what does that mean? Okay, so the FCC can make rules that protect consumers before they're harmed. That's very important. Think about online privacy, something that the Republican Congress repealed. They repealed the rules that we had adopted that would have protected people's privacy online when it came to their internet service providers. The harm that consumers can suffer could be economic, it could be social, it could even be physical. Okay, so having prophylactic rules that protect consumers before they're harmed is really important. The FTC cannot do that.
This is something I think is really dangerous about the government regulation. We have a government that has a history of trying to protect people before they're harmed and doing lots of harm in the process. This assumes that government officials can see the future, that they can predict how things are going to play out. It assumes that they have prophetic abilities, but then they
that's not
pass
right,
regulations
Josh.
that
You don't know how the
protect us before
FCC
the fact.
actually runs, okay? What would happen here, what happens here with net neutrality is if somebody is harmed, okay? If a startup is harmed, and by the way, over 1,000 startups from 50 different states, all 50 states signed a letter to Chairman Pai asking him to keep the rules in place.
And
okay?
small internet providers have been arguing the opposite,
They would
just like
yeah,
Brett.
all 22 of them. They would file a complaint with the FCC, and the FCC would have to take evidence, okay? They don't just do it at the snap of the finger. You have to build a record. Just like here, if Chairman Pai is going to repeal these rules that are wildly popular, that themselves are light touch. Not all of Title II applies to broadband, okay?
Gigi,
you
you're
actually have to
fierce.
have a record here to repeal these rules.
Gigi, your fierce debate.
And I was
Let me
going to
just
say-
allow Raman to come in. Raman, go ahead.
And I was going to just say that, look, if you don't have regulatory frameworks, people don't know who to go to. So I remember the fantastic line I think Chairman Wheeler said after one of the circuit courts upheld the last open internet order, the current open internet order, said that there is a referee, there's someone you can go to. If you don't have that, you have no ability to be able to access a regulator or someone to help protect you. And frankly, for network engineers, they don't also know what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable then. So you leave it to this fuzzy space where those who have the most amount of money and the most amount of power get to make decisions. And that's not a good idea, because if you give space to large gatekeepers to be able to potentially misuse it, some of them will. And you won't get to know until, well, frankly, someone has enough lung power to shout in the newspapers or broadcast press. And that's not a great outcome.
Look, that's a straw man. Nobody is arguing for no regulation. So I just have to disagree with Gigi. There's no Republicans in Congress are saying that there should not be any.
Did you hear Josh? Josh is arguing for no regulation.
I know I'm supposed to be on John's side here. I disagree. I do believe in some internet regulation. It's not that there won't be any cops on the beat. That's just not how it works. The Federal Trade Commission could have brought an enforcement action against Comcast in 2007 when they were throttling BitTorrent, a bellwether in the net neutrality debate. But a Republican FCC chair said this needs to be an FCC issue. Had that not happened, maybe there'd be more expertise at the FTC. But you had one agency decide to take the issue away from another agency.
The chairman of the FCC says he's going to take a weed whacker to the FCC net neutrality.
That doesn't mean
rules.
no regulation. So just last week, Time Warner Cable was sued by the New York Attorney General for failing to deliver on a promise it made to its customers. It said, we're going to give you this speed. New York Attorney General says you're not getting that speed, so they sued. That's the type of law enforcement that Gigi would prefer a bright line ban on certain behaviors that freeze the internet in place, that say you can't innovate at the network level. What I want to do is have the government deal with actual harms. Don't regulate based on a hypothetical. The internet was not a dystopia in 2014. We're dealing with all of these hypotheticals, like startups are all going to be destroyed and they're going to slow this down and put you in a slow lane. That stuff was not happening.
So I'm in the slow lane and then I have to get some help.
No, no one's saying that.
Consumers harm before the FTC.
How would it work then?
How would it work? You have the Federal Trade Commission enforce anything that an ISP says it's going to do. If an ISP says they're for net neutrality, which they do, and you don't have to trust them. I understand why people don't want to trust their internet provider. The Federal Trade Commission can hold them to account. If not the Federal Trade Commission, all of the anti-competitive conduct that people like John Oliver have been warning about, you have a Department of Justice. And I get it. They're run by Republicans right now. And if you're a net neutrality activist, you might not trust the Republicans. That's why we have Democratic state attorneys general, just like the one in New York, that could bring an enforcement action. But here's the thing. You remove Title II. No one is saying this should be the end of the discussion. It definitely won't be. But you want to have strong net neutrality that lasts from one administration to another? The only way to do that is legislation. The fact that we're even having this conversation proves my point.
We're going round in circles.
You had one chairman say this. You have another chairman say that. The point is we have a major policy disagreement in this country that needs to be resolved in Congress. And Gigi, I'm sorry, but Chairman John Thune of the Senate Commerce Committee and Chairman Walden of the Energy and Commerce in the House, they have had the same position on this issue, whether it was President Trump in office or President Obama. They want to pass a legislative compromise, and that's the only way to resolve this debate.
But they had a bill in 2014 that
Robin, I hear
Robin
Robin piping up there, but I'm going to go first because this is definitely an international audience who are watching this conversation. We've delved quite deeply into U.S. politics, throwing out some names there, but I want to remind you all why other people should care via a video comment. This is from Evan Greer, who's the campaign director for an organization called Fight for the Future, and he addresses exactly that.
If you're outside the US, but you use services that are based here, like Google, Facebook, Twitter, and lots of the other companies that you probably use every single day, this is going to have an impact on you. It could jack up the costs that you pay for services, make those services worse, and overall make the internet less of a diverse and interesting place for freedom of expression and exchange of ideas.
So Josh, you are located right now in China, and Raman, you are in India. Raman, why should people in India or China care about the net neutrality issue here in the United States?
See, firstly, the reality is that the US's engagement on net neutrality helped set some of the context for the rest of the world. It even just showed how emotional it was. That's the reason why when you saw the net neutrality, debate come to Europe, you saw thousands of people stand up. In India, you saw 1.2 million people write to India's telecom regulator. It's now quite dispiriting to see the clear model set in place by the US Open Internet Order go away to a fuzzy debate where telecom lobbyists and others say, oh, there's certain people you can do, there's certain harm we thought might happen, so we're going to tear this apart. And that's deeply troubling. And it also sends this effect to other regulators. You already see big US telecommunications companies writing to other regulators saying, look what Chairman Pai is doing. Maybe you shouldn't consider the net neutrality rules you are working on right now, or you're trying to implement, just because they're trying to think of something new and tear it apart.
Sure.
And that's why most people care. They saw the US as a role model on this, and well, it no longer will be if Chairman Pai's proposal goes ahead.
Yeah, but that cuts both ways. So you could make the argument that the US had a positive influence on the way that India decided to regulate net neutrality. I would say the opposite. I'm not expecting the viewers to trust me, the American, arguing with someone who's in India right now, but here's the deal. Only 20% of Indians right now have an internet connection. 80% do not. Facebook had offered a program called Free Basics, which essentially says it's an on-ramp to the internet. They give you 100 or so websites. It includes Facebook. It also includes things like local municipal websites, which could be helpful for someone to have, or maybe some healthcare information. Now, that wasn't a full internet experience. Under the absolutist view of net neutrality, that's not okay. The problem is people who use Free Basics, 50% of them within 1 month sign up for the full internet. So it's an on-ramp to the internet. And unfortunately, the Indian telecom regulator...
I think at this point, we do have to listen to Raman, as he is sitting in India. Raman, go ahead.
And I love what the statistics are provided, because it got held up by the Indian regulator saying, by the way, we've only heard that from Facebook, nobody else. And the reality is, after those rules were issued, which was 1 year ago, millions of Indians have gone online. In fact, internet uptake jumped, by the way, not because of one company doing, charity and saying that, look, we'll enter into a specialist deal with a couple of telecommunications providers and break net neutrality. It happened because Indian telecom companies said, we will invest more, we will get more stuff done, we will compete on price, and that got more people online. In fact, people said the skies will fall, people will not go online, everything, millions of Indians will be cut off from the internet, and that didn't happen. So you can just imagine that I'm slightly skeptical of those sorts of arguments.
I'm not saying the sky is falling. You had an innovative business offering that was helping some people, and it was taken away because the United States decided to impose its view of net neutrality on the world.
It's a very good point to take a pause, because we are segueing into a show that we actually did. When did we do the Free Basics show? Last year? So I want to ask you, just as a wrap-up, because I know we could sit here for another half an hour, but we only have a small window left online. So I'm actually going to ask you, in your one-sentence case for your position. Let's start with Raman to wrap up the show. Raman.
My position is simple. You need clear rules to help telecommunications providers, users, and everyone know what they can do, and you need a referee to help do that. You shouldn't have something that requires multiple law degrees and tons of money to hire law firms to be able to engage. So let's create something that users care about, preferably not just talking heads on TV. And I'm one of them right now.
All right, Raman. Bye. Joshua.
The free market is the strongest regulator of the ISPs. It's stronger than the government. It's stronger than any regulation we can pass. But we need to let people regulate the internet service providers rather than giving them favors from the government, which is what most regulation turns into.
Gigi.
The net neutrality rules from 2015 have worked. The sky has not fallen. People love these rules. They moderate the behavior of heavily consolidated internet service providers who are not subject to competition, who charge very, very high rates, and frankly, whose costs for building those networks are going down. So it's the ISPs and their friends that are opening up this debate again, and there's no need for it.
Everyone supports a free and open internet. We all want to have access to the lawful content we want online. We disagree about how to regulate net neutrality. The place to hash out those disagreements is Congress, and we can't play telecom policy ping pong every time we have an election. The only way to resolve the debate that we're having in this room right now is for Congress to pass a law that protects an open internet once and for all.
It was a very invigorating game of ping pong, though, Guess. Thank you for that. You gave me a workout, and Malika as well. Malika, what do you have?
I will end with these two tweets. Brett has resurfaced. He says, so-called net neutrality regulation will therefore lead to internet censorship, as we've seen in Turkey, Egypt, China. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end is protect our internet. The group here saying this is a free speech issue, it's a free press issue, a civil rights issue, and a human rights issue.
Thank you, Guess, very much for being part of our discussion and making net neutrality extremely exciting and worth the conversation. Appreciate your time. Take care, everybody.